My mom was a mortician, and she's shared some pretty intense stories over the years. The creepiest ones would probably be about the guy who had his face eaten off by wild boars while hunting. Guess he wasn't that good at it. Or the guy who fell into a wood chipper. A funny thing happened a few days after one of those incidents. I was at breakfast with some high school friends who were trying to gross out the girls at the table by telling them about those incidents. When they noticed I wasn't really bothered by it, I kept chewing and said, "Yeah, my mom got that guy. Said it was fucking gross." Everyone went silent, and when I looked up, they all looked pale. I shrugged and said, "Oh, y'all forgot she's a mortician, didn't you?" Then I just kept eating. One of the most uncomfortable and sad experiences for her involved a morbidly obese woman. When they somehow managed to get her onto the gurney at her home, the wheels made deep indentations in the wood floors as they pushed her out. This woman, who some bullies might cruelly call a whale, had a profound love for blue whales. Her family went on and on about it. When the time came to bring her clothes for the wake, they brought a big blue muumuu and a gaudy blue whale brooch. Then they handed my mom a CD to play. Typically, it's church hymns or sad country songs, so no one listened to it beforehand. The service started. My mom popped the CD in, and suddenly, goddamn blue whale calls filled the funeral home. My mom was very professional with her job, but every funeral director had to excuse themselves to compose themselves. One of the most bizarre experiences I had involved a particularly difficult family. None of them could agree on what to do with their dad. One faction wanted burial while the other demanded cremation. After much shouting, they finally agreed on a compromise. They wanted us to cut their father's body in half. That way, one half could be cremated and the other half buried. I had to explain to the unfortunate arranger, who looked beyond exhausted at this point, that no, we could not saw a human body in half because that would be very illegal and very messy. The most uncomfortable experience I had was when I was 5 feet 3 inches and about 120 pounds. I was sent on a removal at a private residence with my supervisor. When we arrived, the family of the deceased consisted of half a dozen or so very tall men, each well over 6 feet. Coincidentally, my supervisor was also male and unusually tall. They greeted him cordially, but as soon as I entered the home, it was like a switch was thrown. Every single one of them looked at me with pure contempt. They did not speak to me, only stared and glared. They wouldn't allow me to touch their father/grandfather. I was shouldered out of the way and blocked by the grandsons. I don't intimidate easily, but I had a wall of hostile giants staring me down from inches away. Once the deceased was on the gurney, they refused to let me push. They assisted my supervisor themselves. It was really, really uncomfortable. The only thing my supervisor and I could think of was that they didn't believe I was strong enough to lift the body. Being small, I got that from time to time, but people were usually trying to be helpful. This was pure anger and hostility. I was a student at the time when my first ever bloater was brought in. Once we popped him, his insides were everywhere. It was a mess. Definitely not something I would recommend experiencing. On my first night shift, I thought the staff were messing with me because I kept hearing what sounded like breathing. It turned out to be a fresh body releasing gas. I had never dealt with anyone dying within an hour of being brought in, so hearing this body breathe was terrifying. Although I now know it's normal for bodies to release gas and sometimes move, as a student, the staff liked to play tricks on us. A particularly bizarre case involved piecing a man back together after he had committed suicide by shooting himself in the face. The family wanted an open casket, so we did our best to make him presentable. We then asked one family member to see if they still wanted the open casket, as we felt it might not be appropriate. The father came in, saw that no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't restore his appearance, and agreed that the family shouldn't see him this way. However, on the day we delivered him to the funeral parlor, the family changed their minds and decided to have an open casket anyway. We later found out that the rest of the family didn't know he had shot himself in the face. This led to us receiving a letter of complaint from other family members about the open casket. I finished my time as a student a few days after that incident. Despite the challenges and unexpected moments, I would still love to pursue a career in this field. My dad was a coroner before switching to being a doctor. I can't remember all the medical details accurately, but I recall a bizarre case he once shared about examining the body of a former birthday clown. There were no external wounds, so he suspected the cause of death was internal. The clown had gastroparesis, which meant that the stomach contents would be well preserved. When his team opened the body, they found a chaotic scene. There was partially digested birthday cake, edible confetti, streamers, and about a dozen Xanax pills. As my dad sifted through the stomach contents, he found what looked like sponges. He pulled one out and realized it was a sponge dino from those capsules that expand in water. He found more, enough to create a small biome. At first, my dad thought he was being pranked. The story eventually pieced together. The clown decided to end his life with Xanax and booze. Before doing so, he ate a store-bought cake with everything on it, and for some reason he swallowed a bunch of dino sponges too. It was a surreal and tragic ending for a birthday clown. My best friend works in the death business and often shares some rather interesting stories about her job. My favorite involves a gurney and some stairs. To set the scene, a family called in to report that their mother had passed away in her third-story apartment, which had narrow halls and no elevators. She went to pick up the body with an assistant. The woman weighed close to 300 pounds, so they carefully lifted her onto the gurney and began the journey down to the van. The whole family was there, in hysterics, crowding around as they made their way to the stairs. About halfway down the first flight of stairs, the body started to slide. There was no way to reposition, so my friend, who was at the foot of the gurney, ended up at the same level as the freshly deceased's rear end. Trying to make the best of the situation, they continued down the stairs, trying not to shift the body any more than necessary. The thing about dead bodies is that gas starts to exit pretty quickly, and you can probably guess where this story is going. With every step they took, the body began to let out farts straight into my friend's face. Despite this, she had to keep a straight face while getting crop dusted by the deceased, all while the family watched. Many years ago, I was a student in the anthropology department at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Bill Bass, a sort of P.T. Barnum of forensic anthropology, and he was the department head. A major focus of the department was forensic anthropology. This was before DNA testing, so skeletal forensics was essential in identifying bodies that were partially decayed. Dr. Bass would get about 15 to 20 cases every year, decayed or skeletal remains, to hopefully identify or at least profile race, sex, approximate age, any distinguishing characteristics, and sometimes cause of death. Usually, these were vagrants, crime victims, or historic or prehistoric Native American remains. One time, in a little town in West Tennessee, they found a clothed but fully skeletonized body in a patch of dense vegetation. The local sheriff and coroner loaded the body into the back of a pickup truck and drove it all the way across the state, for 100 miles, to Knoxville so Dr. Bass could do an ID. When the truck arrived, Dr. Bass went out and opened the body bag to find a complete skeleton still fully dressed. He looked the body up and down, then reached into the front pocket of the corpse's jeans and pulled out a wallet. He opened it and read off the name, address, race, height, and hair and eye color of the deceased. The sheriff and the coroner were a bit embarrassed. It turned out the dead man had only been missing for about a week, but in the dense foliage of a West Tennessee thicket in midsummer, the bugs and beetles had completely stripped his bones of flesh. Dr. Bass did a follow-up to make sure the driver's license and the corpse were a match. Dr. Bass had many interesting cases. He founded the infamous Body Farm, has written several books, both fiction and nonfiction, and is featured in fictional form in many of Patricia Cornwell's crime novels. This story isn't mine, but it involves my dad and his friend, Mr. Mort, who was a mortician. My dad was doing some business on the other side of the state, close to where Mr. Mort lived. Mr. Mort invited him for coffee but added, "Hey, while you're here, can you help me with a particularly heavy one?" He needed help with a large body that had to be cremated. My dad, being in great shape, agreed. The body in question was a 350 to 400-pound woman who needed to be moved from a gurney to the conveyor belt contraption to be rolled into the crematorium furnace. Normally, She'd be placed in a cardboard coffin, but she was too large, so she had to go in wearing a hospital gown. After some planning and effort, they successfully moved her onto the belt without dropping her, pushed her into the furnace, and turned it on. The crematorium was nearly automated. Push a button, and it went through the necessary steps to turn whatever was inside to ash. So, my dad and Mr. Mort set it up and then walked down the street for a coffee. About 20 minutes later, they saw a fire truck go by and thought nothing of it. Then another one went by. This was a small town in western South Dakota, so there weren't many fire trucks. They walked outside and saw flames coming from the crematorium, along with some oil leaking from the building. The smell of burnt ham filled the air. What had happened was that the woman was so large that there wasn't enough space around her body in the furnace to generate the heat necessary to properly cremate her. However, there was enough heat to melt her skin and turn her fat reserves into hot oil, which leaked out. The oil set the building on fire. Thankfully, it was in a separate garage, so the entire mortuary didn't go up in flames. The flaming oil started to flow down the driveway and into the street. One of the fire engines parked too close to the fire, and the hot oil flowed past its tires, melting and popping them. This led to a bit of pandemonium, with firefighters spraying the flames and others jumping into the two fire trucks to move them away as quickly as possible. We picked up a suicide on a major holiday. It was Thanksgiving or Christmas. I can't remember which. We took her back to the funeral home, undressed her, and had to wait for the medical examiner. The family decided to cremate her. We dressed her for a viewing, and everything seemed normal. Later that day, she was ready to be cremated. I put her in the cremation chamber, started the machine, and went back inside to embalm someone else. About an hour in, I heard 5 loud pops. My first thought was that it was a pacemaker, brain stimulator, or something else I had missed. When the cremation was finished, I swept the ashes into the tray and, to my astonishment, a small handgun came out. I had seen all of her during the preparation process. Seriously, where could she have had that hidden? The only possible spot was inside her vagina. The question that haunts me is why. It's been over 10 years, and I'm still left wondering, WTF? I was a gravedigger at 18, and it was my first full-time job. I was learning the ropes when the boss man told me to mark out a grave. A wife was joining her husband many decades after his interment. My coworker taught me how to spec out an adjoining grave site. Split the tombstone in half, move over 6 inches, then plot the new grave with string according to the prescribed dimensions. I did exactly that. Then the backhoe arrived. As the backhoe guy dug the grave, a problem emerged. We could see bones in the dirt. My coworker stopped the backhoe guy and started yelling at me. I told him I marked the site exactly as he had instructed. 6 inches to the left of the center of the marker, then 3 feet wide, 8 feet long, etc. I did as I was told. However, it appeared the husband wasn't sited correctly and was not buried in a vault. His cheap pine coffin had rotted, and he was everywhere. But it was still all my fault, apparently. The backhoe had dug down an extra foot into the husband's side of the site. I was tasked with jumping in and reinterring all the bones on his side. So, I jumped in and packed all those bones and dirt into his side. My coworker and the backhoe guy had a laugh while yelling at me about bones I had missed and making me pack them in. We walled up his side of the grave nice and finished up the wife's grave. It was some grisly shit, man. But hey, it was 1982, and I was making $10 an hour, which was big money at that time. With great wealth comes great responsibilities. I work in forensics, specifically as an entomologist. My job involves extracting insects from decomposing bodies to estimate the time of death or supplement existing evidence. It's as grotesque an occupation as you can imagine. The most odious cadaver I encountered was the partial skeletal remains of an 8-month pregnant mother. Her body had given life to a plethora of maggots, bot flies, and moth larvae, which were consuming her hair like a monstrous funeral shroud. The tiny bones of the baby were disintegrating under the unrelenting feasting of ham beetles, as its flesh was too dry for maggots to find purchase. They preferred the malleable flesh of the mother's face and breasts. Observing the corpse, her exposed womb appeared to be giving birth. Many adult beetles were scuttling over her pubic bone and into the cradle of her pelvis. She lay supine, her limbs not splayed in distress, but her expression was indiscernible due to the divots of bot flies imbued in the flesh of her cheeks. Then I began my extraction. It was a drug-induced suicide, which encapsulated the tranquility of her and her child's death. It was my birthday last year and I was on call. I got a call at 3:30 a.m. about a residential death. Our medical examiner, M.E., called the funeral home and told us to bring reinforcements. I met up with a coworker, and we arrived at the house about 30 minutes later. The M.E. pulled us aside and informed us that the deceased was in the basement, standing at 6 feet 8 inches and weighing probably 300 pounds. With just 3 funeral home employees and the M.E. at the house, we knew we had a tough job ahead. By the grace of God, we managed to get the guy onto our cot, but then we had to figure out how to get him up the flight of stairs. The 2 older guys took the front, and my coworker and I took the back. When you take a cot up a flight of stairs, you don't realize how hard it is until you get both sets of wheels on the steps. The first 4 stairs went pretty well, but we knew the back wheels were about to go up. I've dealt with large people and stairs before, but this was a different challenge. There was really only enough room for 1 person on the stair, so I volunteered to try. We made it maybe 2 stairs before his body shifted on the cot and started sliding back. We brought him back down and ended up calling the fire department. The fire department brought 10 guys. We tied off the cot and tried making it up the stairs again, but it just wasn't going to happen. The fire chief and my funeral home owner talked to the family upstairs. After a while, the chief came down with a sawzall and told us we were making a door. We cut a hole in the side of the wall, wheeled him out, and put an end to the longest removal of my career. One of the firefighters was a woodworker, and he came back that day and fixed up the wall in the basement. I showed up at the fire station that day with 5 pizzas and a case of beer to thank them. About 7 years ago, my friend took a job as a custodian for a funeral home. The job sounded great from what he told me. It was a graveyard shift, part-time, but the pay was good. The funeral home was relatively small, consisting of a medium-sized chapel, an extension to seat more people, a hall with bathrooms, and a few offices. Next to the funeral home was a separate garage-like building where the mortician did his work. Now let's get to the story. He only worked the job for 6 days before quitting. Here's how he described it to me. The first few days went okay. He was nervous about working there at night but managed to brave it out. On his 4th day, after finishing up in the main building, he went to quickly check the second building. From how he explained it, he didn't really need to clean much in there, just do a quick walkthrough. He went in, quickly looked around, and then started to leave. Just as he was about to exit, he heard something drop and hit the ground. He stopped and stared back for a moment, then decided to ignore it and left. Things got weird when he walked back into the main building to put away his supplies. He swore he saw, out of the corner of his eye, someone sitting in one of the pews, get up and walk away. The sight stunned him with fear. He took a moment to gather himself, then walked out and locked everything up for the night. Just as he was about to leave, he heard a loud bang, like a door slamming. He bolted to his car and sped home. The following days didn't have any drastic incidents like that, but that single event was enough for him to know the job just wasn't for him. This story comes from my mother, back when she was a teenager. A guy she knew took a job at the local funeral home, working the graveyard shift. Everything was fine for the first few months, though he often felt weirded out and claimed the building was haunted. One evening, they got a call from the hospital about a lady ready for pickup. They brought her in, and the guy couldn't shake a bad feeling. Later that night, the mortician had to step out, leaving him alone with the body. As he went about his work, still on edge, he suddenly heard a low, soft moan. He brushed it off, thinking it was just his mind playing tricks on him. A short while later, he heard the moan again, louder this time. It was late, he was alone, and he told himself it was just the old plumbing making noise. But when the moan came again, even louder, he was sure he wasn't imagining things. He knew he had heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was that the mortician was playing a prank on him, knowing he was already shaken. Determined to catch him in the act, he marched over and yanked back the sheet covering the body, expecting to find the mortician hiding nearby. Instead, the supposedly dead lady grabbed his wrist. He let out a scream and bolted for the door, running all the way home and forgetting his car. It turned out the old lady wasn't dead after all. The hospital had made a mistake. Hooray for 1950s medicine. She had been in a coma or something, and they were sure she had passed away earlier that morning. She woke up at the funeral home, scaring the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. The guy quit the next day and swore he would never set foot in that funeral home again. My dad is a mortician, and we actually lived above the funeral home. My life was a bit like the movie My Girl. He's been a mortician for over 40 years and has tons of stories. The worst by far is the story of the human soup guy. Apparently, this elderly gentleman passed away while taking a bath with the water still running. He lived alone with very little family. I don't remember how long he was in the bath before someone found him, but it was long enough for his body to turn to mush due to the constant hot water. When my dad went to pick up the body, it was a gruesome scene. The heat and the duration had reduced the body to a horrific, soupy state. He said the smell was the worst he had ever encountered. When he got back to the office later that day, his boss told him to throw away his suit and promised to buy him a new one.